Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. I'm Rachel, a marketing coordinator here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com or by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. One of the many upcoming events we are looking forward to is Tiffany D. Cross in conversation with Ellie Missel about Cross's new book, Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy, this Friday, the 18th. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Jessica Garrison and Sarah Weinman. Jessica Garrison is a West Coast investigations editor for BuzzFeed News and spent more than a decade as a reporter at the Los Angeles Times. She has received numerous awards, including a George Polk Award, Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, and a National Magazine Award for a series on immigrant guest workers. Garrison's new book, The Devil's Harvest, A Ruthless Killer, a Terrorized Community, and the Search for Justice in California's Central Valley, is the gut-wrenching, unbelievable true story of Jose Martinez and how the criminal justice system fails our country's most vulnerable immigrant communities. The Devil's Harvest is a page-turning, suspenseful story of a drug cartel hitman who got away with murder after murder in California's Central Valley for 3 decades. Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita and editor of Women Crime Writers, 8 suspense novels of the 1940s and 50s, and Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives. She covers book publishing for Publishers Marketplace and has written for the New York Times, the New Republic, The Guardian, and BuzzFeed, among other outlets. In her new book, Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession, Weinman brings together an exemplary collection of recent true crime tales. She culls some of the most refreshing and exciting contemporary journalists and chroniclers of crime working today, showcasing writing about true crime across the broadest possible spectrum, while also reflecting what makes crime stories so transfixing and irresistible to the modern reader. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. And most importantly, please consider supporting Jessica, Sarah, and Powell's by purchasing a copy of their books from us. A link to purchase their books will be shared in the chat throughout the evening. And without any further ado, please welcome Jessica and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And it's so great to be here tonight, virtually and physically, with this event with Jessica. I feel like our books are linked, so I'm just going to hold up them and I'll explain why. So this is Jessica's, which you should buy. And this is mine. And the reason why I say that we're linked is because this cover is drawn from a photo that was taken from the original BuzzFeed piece that Jessica wrote some years ago that became the basis for The Devil's Harvest. So I thought, in talking about what led you to write this as a book, I'm also interested in how you were able to take it from a reported story that I think had its genesis when you were still at the LA Times to BuzzFeed to book. So I'm curious about that transformation and, of course, the substance of this incredible and heart-wrenching story that's in The Devil's Harvest.
I mean, I think that's such a good question, and I love that you held up both books. So, I mean, I think it's true. It's this story. I first heard about this story when I was an editor at the LA Times, and I was the morning assignment editor, which was a very bad job for me because I'm really not a morning person. And so I would go in kind of grumpy and a little bit sleepy every morning and take a look at kind of what's used to be known as The Wire, which is what all the kind of news stories happening around the state, and make sure that I had, that the LA Times had reporters assigned to each of them. And so I came in one morning kind of late, as I often was. I'm not a morning person, kind of clutching my coffee. And I saw that a contract killer was being extradited from Alabama. A suspected contract killer was being extradited from Alabama to California. And it didn't say the man's name. It just said a contract killer, and it said that he was from a tiny little town in Tulare County. And I kind of woke up and I thought, how do you kill that many people while living in one of these tiny little towns? Because I'd spent a fair amount of time as a reporter in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the southern part of the Central Valley. And I spent part of my, grew up a little bit in the northern part of the valley, which is, all part of the same Central Valley. So I called up the Fresno reporter, and I think I might have woken her up, and sent her down to Tulare County. And then the story ran. And shortly after that, I left the LA Times and went to BuzzFeed, but I kept wondering, how did that happen? How did someone get away with that many murders while living in a town of about 4,000 people? And so several years later, when I was at BuzzFeed, I decided to look into it. And I think what I found in the story, but much more in the book, was the reason this man was able to get away with this is really a story of a place. And that is the place where he was from, the town where he was from, and all of the towns, or many of the towns in the San Joaquin Valley. And so it's a book about a series of crimes, but it's also a book about a place and how justice works in that place.
And I feel like the book wouldn't work if there wasn't this concentration on the sense of place, and specifically, I'm going to mispronounce, but it is Earlimart. Is that how you say the town's name?
Earlimart. I mean,
Earlimart.
Like,
and I both love and I'm also a little disturbed by the genesis of the name, because it's like, it's early to market, right?
Fruits, I mean, a lot of these towns were started by essentially the railroads, right?
Yeah.
And the railroads like put in a little spur, and then they had some land, and they were like, look at this wonderful place, come build a town, we'll sell it to you. And so Earlimart actually initially was a place called, and this I will mispronounce, which is wrong because it's my book, Alila. And then, which was founded on the site of the old railroad spur, and then Alila flooded, and then Earlimart was founded for vegetables to be early to market. And almost immediately, kind of certain, the town was also very shortly thereafter the site of one of the great train robberies of the 19th century. So you kind of have like gangster crime kind of almost from the beginning.
And yet here is this, it has this, not criminal history, but some degree of it. And yet Martinez was, I don't even think hiding in plain sight does justice to how almost flagrant it was that he was able to commit so many crimes. And so I wondered if you would just sort of talk through some of his early history and some of his travels, and especially the degree to which law enforcement knew and just kind of turned a blind eye.
I mean, I think, so, he was active for a very long time, right? His first murder that he has confessed to was 1978, and his first murder for which he was convicted is 1980. And he was, still a teenager for those, and his last murder in Tulare County, I believe, was 2011. So by about 2000, he starts turning up as a suspect. His name is mentioned in the police reports going all the way back to 1980. So certainly they, and by about 2000, they knew that his nickname was the Black Hand. So, which isn't, like they kind of knew that, and they knew he was a suspect. I think that's the great question at the heart of the book. Why did he get away with it? And part of the reason that he got away with it, as he would tell you if you asked him, was that he was pretty good at murder. And
did you ask him directly why he got away with it?
I did.
Okay. And that was his exact answer, or did he kind of dance around that?
I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think his exact words were something along the lines of like, I was so damn good at it. Which I think the police agreed with, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was, he was killing by and large people that he did not know, to whom he had very little connection. And he was shooting them, and then with no witnesses, and then leaving their bodies in like vacant fields. And so you put all those things together, and those are hard murders to solve. However, the police keep going to his house, right? I mean, they go to his house in 1982, they go to his house in 1988, they go, and at no point, it seems, does anyone ever go, why do we keep going to this guy's house?
It's like they have to keep reinventing this wheel, but all they had to do was connect dots, except they didn't.
It's like, and in their defense, like, you know, I think I put it this somewhere, you know, it's like we know who did it, right? So if you know who did it, it's very easy to look back and be like, obviously. But I think these are, you know, so he was very good in that sense. And I think, you know, also he starts committing murders right after this period of huge tumult in the Valley, which is the kind of, you know, big labor movement that was the United Farm Workers. And there was a great deal of distrust between these communities and particularly the Tulare County Sheriff's Department. I mean, Cesar Chavez once testified to the California State Assembly and basically said, I've been all over the country. I've dealt with the Texas Rangers. I've dealt with the sheriffs in Florida. Nobody is as brutal as the Tulare County Sheriffs. And so, you know, he was kind of became active in a period where people really did not trust the sheriffs. You know, that said, there were some very dedicated detectives who tried to solve these murders, and they did not. And then by the time you get to like the 2000s, you know, he was a known suspect, but I think that they were very reluctant to charge him, in some ways, in part because I think they thought that he would get off.
Right.
And so, you know, nobody wants to, you can't be tried twice. And so you can see why a prosecutor would be like, well, I don't know if I want to take that to court.
And there was one instance where they got close and then there was misconduct in the department. So that was sort of taking the time and attention.
That was interestingly, so he I don't think there was ever misconduct there was definitely some misconduct in the Tulare County Sheriff's Department, never involving his cases, but, you know, he was also active in a place where a lot of officers were, you know, having some corruption issues. And so he did get a case tossed because the arresting officers were later got in some real corruption trouble. It wasn't a murder case. It was some other kind of case. But yeah, that to me, I mean, to go back to your original question, which is like, why did I think this was a book? Yeah. I thought it was a book, in part because it's an insane story, but mostly because I thought that this insane story told us something about a place we don't hear about very much, which is California's Central Valley. And also because I thought that, like, you know, we don't, you know, it's its own place, the Central Valley of California, but I think a lot of rural places in America are like this. They're kind of under-policed, and there are sort of, you know, people that really don't get justice and don't expect it.
What was the sort of balance in terms of trying to get people to talk to you? Because you do talk to a wide range of people connected to Martinez, especially family members, but also family members of the murder victims. And in some instances, you either leave their names out entirely or they're pseudonymous. So, you know, I just wondered what balance and maybe struggles you had in terms of getting people to tell you essentially about the worst thing that happened to them or happened to their family.
So I don't think I had any pseudonyms.
Okay.
I mean, there were people that were referred to, you know, like the cousin, the brother, the like.
Which is an interesting choice. Like, you could have given them pseudonyms and instead opted not to.
Well, pseudonyms I've never used them. So I think it just felt too strange. But, you know, I mean, I think what surprised me the most about reporting this, and I don't know the most, a lot of things surprised me, but was when I reached out to the families of the victims. Almost all of them that I was able to reach, you know, some of them were like, I don't want my name anywhere near this because I'm scared, but almost all of them were willing to talk to me. And they almost all said a variation on the same thing, which I think really kind of hit me, which is, you know, no one has asked about this. Like, you know, you're not the first person, but like, you know, I want to tell my story because this matters. And for a long time, it felt like nobody cared.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the family members of the victims were willing to talk, I think, because, they hadn't been, anyone who's been a kind of a journalist, especially in California for any length of time, has participated in some kind of hideous media circus where everyone is running at the victim. This wasn't like that. Like, these people had almost never been heard, had a reporter come to them before. And then, I kind of tried to talk to everybody. And, some people were happy to talk. Some people just absolutely never did. Some people took a little bit of convincing. Some people, it was like any kind of project like that.
I think the other reason that I feel like our books are linked is that even before putting together this collection and getting the final cover, like I had read your BuzzFeed story thinking it was a really good and smart piece that really was in keeping with the argument of my project. And then I found out it was a book. I was like, oh no, I can't reprint it, but that's even better because there's this book. So maybe this is a good time to kind of get into how I conceived of the anthology.
Oh yeah, let's talk about your book. So let's, I definitely, it's time. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
About, I want you to talk a little bit about what your book is for people here who don't know, but I want to take you back to the moment where you were like, I want to do this. I want to make an anthology. Like, was there a particular like series of pieces that made you think, oh, we should put, like, where did the idea come from?
So Unspeakable Acts has been gestating for quite a while. I think that I first signed the contract for this anthology right before I turned in the first draft for the Real Lolita. So that would have been the summer, the early fall of 17. And I'd been thinking about it really seriously for at least a year and a half. I had written a piece for The Guardian. They had asked me to write about true crime and the ongoing boom, which, as with all things that are in a quote renaissance moment, I thought it would eventually crest. But I think, as we've seen, true crime is such a perennial favorite in American culture that even when there are upticks, they never really backslide. They just sort of plateau or come up and down. So I date the so-called boom to the phenomenal success of the podcast Serial in the fall of 2014, where it introduced crime storytelling by an outlet and by reporters who weren't really known for crime storytelling. You didn't think of This American Life and Sarah Koenig as true crime people, but they wanted to tell the story of the murder of Heyman Lee and her suspected killer, former boyfriend Adnan Syed, in a podcast week by week, and it became this gigantic success. And it kind of broadened the idea of who was interested in true crime narratives, and also what true crime storytelling could do, that it wasn't necessarily following the beginning, middle, and end that you see in more traditional crime stories, be they fiction or nonfiction. And the fact that it had this less than tidy ending where Sarah Koenig's like, well, here's my theory of what I think happened, but I'm not sure and I can't be sure. And then it spawned like other podcasts and other documentaries and other books, and it was like this whole industry of post-serial stuff. But at the same time, there were all these, especially writers and journalists, who were publishing crime stories that were breaking the mold open even more. So I remember reading one of the earliest pieces that's published in Unspeakable Acts is Jennifer Penn's Revenge by Karen Caho, which was, I think, in the summer of 2015. And it was her first big feature and her first crime story, but I just thought it was super well done in terms of being the story of a young girl who's lost her way, who is buckling under tremendous pressures from a family and a community, and commits the most heinous act you can think of against a family, but is also it's a story about the community that she comes from, and that Karen herself knew. She didn't know the Jennifer Penn so well, but she knew Penn's boyfriend, I believe, or very good friend. So it was just like that level of empathetic storytelling was already there, and I was like, this is a good story. Then Michelle Steen's piece on Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her mother, that was published also in BuzzFeed and became this again, this phenomenon and spawned well, it didn't spawn Erin Lee Carr's documentary, but she was in it and it was sort of happening concurrently. And then there was the TV show, The Act. But it to me, such a strong piece that I wanted to have it in print somewhere.
Right.
So those were sort of the early pieces that I thought of. But I also realized, and I always realize this late when I'm putting together collections or thinking through stuff that I edit, that there has to be some kind of sustaining argument for why I do what I do. So with the two anthologies that I did, the first was of short stories of crime fiction by women from the 40s and 70s. That was because I felt like there was this lost generation of women crime writers. And I wanted to consider them not just as individual writers, but as a group in conversation with American hard-boiled detective fiction and golden age mysteries by British writers. And then that carried through when I collected some novels from the 40s and 50s by some of these women, just making that argument even stronger with the imprimatur of Library of America. So with Unspeakable Acts, the other driving force in my mind was there used to be an annual series called, it's had a number of names, but I think of it as Best American Crime Reporting. And so every year it would collect the best crime journalism, and it was largely white and largely male. And I felt like things were starting to shift. And the stories that are in Unspeakable Acts are largely by women. And then once it was done and getting ready, it was launching in an environment when I think we're reconsidering who should be telling stories and how marginalized communities should be best reported on and represented by. And I felt like my anthology went some way, but there's still so much further to go, which is why I ended up writing this piece that was published on BuzzFeed.
So let's talk, I think, so I have two questions for you. I think the first one, back to your book, which is, it's divided. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, I think the structure of your book is really interesting. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit and sort of how that makes the larger argument. And then I think then I want to ask my second question, which is about the future of the genre of true crime. But talk a little bit about the sort of how these, I feel like you put it to me like, anthology as argument, but also like structure as argument too. And the thing is that I wanted an anthology where you start with what you think of as traditional long form narratives, but that are truly the most exemplary narrative long form crime journalism that you can think of. So I mentioned Karen Caho's piece, I mentioned Michelle Dean's piece. I knew that I had to include a piece by Pamela Koloff, who is truly one of our greatest investigative reporters and is a wonderful human and is like, what a piece.
She's a role model for how to do it.
That particular piece.
That particular piece.
Great shame. I had not read that piece until I saw it in your book. And it's
and one of the reasons I wanted to include that particular piece, aside from the fact that
I was watching, it's about the shooting at UT in University of Texas in, I will forget the year.
1966.
There we go. Okay.
And so it was about one of the surviving victims of that mass shooting. She had been pregnant at the time. And so Koloff masterfully traces what happened to Claire Wilson in the immediate aftermath and in the many decades, I think about a half a century thereafter. And I believe that was the last piece she ever wrote for Texas Monthly before moving over to ProPublica and the New York Times. So again, I wanted to kind of have that in print and sort of memorialize that in as permanent as book publishing ever is, but in, between two covers. And then the last piece of that first section is by another wonderful writer named Rachel Monroe. She wrote an amazing book published last year of meta true crime called Savage Appetites, which I would strongly endorse. And I feel so lucky that so many of the people who have published pieces in this collection are either have published great books or are about to publish great
I feel like
books.
we should put all these books in the chat, sell more books for pals. Like, but yeah, because they're no.
I mean, I did curate a list on bookshop.org, which maybe we can port over to Powell's, which has a list of all of the books, because it's a pretty stellar list. I mean, between Patrick Radden Keefe and his introduction and his books. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the reason I wanted to include this piece by Rachel Monroe called The Perfect Man Who Wasn't, which was originally published in The Atlantic, is because there is this strain in true crime about grifters and about con artists. And why are we so fascinated by them, and why do people keep falling for it? And I thought Monroe's piece was a real, like, one of the really excellent examples of how to tell a grifter story, but also get at how she herself is susceptible and why anybody, any one of us, could fall for cons. So that's the first section. And the second section, which I think of as the meta true crime section, or where crime meets culture, it's where true crime storytelling kind of has an extra twist. So, you know, full disclosure, that's the section where I put one of my stories, because it is a little bit of a specialty, especially if it's a story in the mid-century that has some cultural element. I mean, I wrote a whole book about the real life case that inspired the novel Lolita. My piece was about the true crime that inspired an iconic independent film by a female filmmaker named Barbara Loden. And the film is called Wanda. It celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. It's amazing. And the story of the lady bank robber who helped inspire it is also amazing. I think the pieces that really stand out in that section, you have Alice Bolin, who wrote a wonderful book called Dead Girls, which were essays sort of examining the tropes of crime fiction and true crime. And so this piece was originally published in Vulture, and it was called The Highbrow Dilemma, the Highbrow Ethical Dilemma of True Crime, and looking at the prestige podcasts and documentaries that came in the wake of Serial, and what's the ethical thorniness of these types of productions. And it's something that I'm so glad she wrote, and I still think about that essay a whole lot. Of course, this always happens where I'm like, of course I can't really rattle off every single collection.
That's okay. You don't have to. No, we'll put them all in the chat. No,
yes.
Like, because I think, you know, that let's keep with like the structure and like,
yeah.
Let's.
But the point is just to have more essays as opposed to reported journalism. So there are also essays by Alex Marr on the links between the Slender Man case and another instance of intense teenage friendship gone awry in the 1950s. There's a piece by Elon Green on the missing children behind the music video Runaway Train. And then Sarah Marshall is the co-host of You're Wrong About, a wonderful podcast. I mean, I love that podcast so much. But she wrote a piece which did something extraordinary. It made me want to read about Ted Bundy. Because what I find with a lot of what I think of as overcovered crime stories, I don't want to touch that. Like, if it's the 10th documentary or podcast or book or feature on a case that everybody seems to know, it's like, that's where I start to check out, because I feel like there's so many undercovered stories. But Marshall really found a way in to turn the Ted Bundy story on its head. And so that leads into the last section of the book, which is titled Justice in Society. And this section, I think, is the building block for where true crime has to go.
Okay, good. Very good segue.
The reason I say that is because I think it's really important to reconsider what true crime is and can be. I view it as an incredibly broad, all-encompassing genre. Like, your book it has the hook of multiple murderer, but really it's a story of what's been happening in the Central Valley and the people who are ignored. And so the stories here, you have one by Jason Fragoni on an emergency.
I mean, I think it's such an interesting, like, I just pulled it up.
Yeah.
And the very first sentence of it, I think, is really interesting, right? The first thing Dr. Amy Goldberg told me is that this article would be pointless.
Yeah.
That's a great beginning. But I mean, I think that where does it, what do we do with it?
I think it's just that a story like that about an ER doc who's in the thick of seeing gun violence up close when there's so many mass shootings and we don't actually understand the full visceral impact of gun violence. We sort of drown in statistics or just check out. And we see this happening with the pandemic. We see this happening with any mass event where, it's so far away, it's just easy to kind of deal with problems closer at hand or an individual case closer at hand. Systemic issues are really hard to wrap one's head around, but systemic issues are what we have to wrap our head around.
Right.
So I feel like this section really gets at some of the systemic issues, like Melissa Del Bosque's history of Customs and Border Patrol, because I really wanted something along those lines to get at what I think of as the ultimate true crime in America. I mean, there are two. There's racism and what's been happening at the border, and those are linked. And we can't talk about crime without talking about those broad subjects, but talking about those broad subjects the weight of it is so enormous that it's hard to reckon with, and yet we must reckon with. So it is not so much a paradox, but just something that I'd rather just be like, okay, let's face it and come to terms with it. I don't want to shy away from it. So this section of having more systemic issues with respect to criminal justice was a way to reckon with it. And I think the last two pieces are two of my own favorites in the collection. The one by Leora Smith on Dr. Herbert McDonnell, who helped invent a forensic science technique about blood spatter, and the fact that as it's often employed really is about junk science. And junk science is something I'm particularly interested and passionate about, having studied forensic science long ago when in grad school. And I feel like the criminal justice system lets a lot of charlatans pretend like they're experts, and it leads to catastrophic results. And then the piece by Emma Copley Eisenberg on Sage Smith, a Black trans teen who went missing, and her case was really sort of swept under the rug, and the community wanted answers and they didn't get it, and they still don't have adequate answers. And I just felt like the level of empathetic storytelling that she had in there was just outstanding. And you see that also in the book that Eisenberg published earlier this year, The Third Rainbow Girl, which is this hybrid of true crime storytelling and history and community storytelling and memoir and essay, and it doesn't comfortably fit a category, and that's what I love about it. And so that's kind of where I see true crime heading, that it should defy categories and we should be made uncomfortable. And if we just sort of rest on whatever comfort zones we're in, that's missing the point.
I mean, I think we have like 6 more minutes before we take questions. So I will ask you, one that I've been thinking about a lot, I think, which has to do with the issue of representation, right? And who tells what stories and how and why. And I wonder if that's something you thought about a lot as you were putting this together. And I think, I think it's an interesting to sort of like the way in which crime, in many newspapers, like back in the day, like crime was kind of, the crime reporter was sort of a reporter that, you were trying to get out of crime, you were trying to get out of police and like move up to more, and I think that's really changed. But just sort of like, what I'm starting to babble now, but like, did you think, is that something you've thought about as you both were in your book, and then as you sort of survey the landscape of crime writing over the last 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the most recent piece published in Unspeakable Acts is, I think, November of 2018. And I'm actually really glad that there is the separation between the pieces then and what pieces are emerging now from being in a time of pandemic, and especially of protests because of just the sheer number of police killings of Black and Brown and Indigenous people and the resulting protests from this, that, you know, true crime has been a pretty white genre, and there are almost jokes about the dead white girl trope,
Right.
and the fact that it privileges certain narratives of that ilk. That, you know, it's like one thing that Emma's piece gets into is the fact that Sage Smith went missing at the same time as a white affluent college student, and guess what case got
Right.
disproportionate media attention.
Right.
But I think it's more than that. I'm so glad you brought up this idea of the crime beat as sort of an initial step for a reporter to take, and they're just getting police.
That's not true anymore. I mean, but
No, I don't think it's true at all, because I think there's just a lot of questioning of narratives. Like, if being on the crime beat meant swallowing police press releases as gospel, and now we see that the police are unreliable narrators, and that it's
right.
as important, if not more, to get the story from the community, from the family members, from people who knew victim and potential perpetrator, and come up with a much more nuanced and, I think, valuable and more substantive story. But if you're parachuting in and it's late at night and you're doing an overnight beat and you get a press release and you don't have time,
Right.
that can lead to real danger in how stories are reported. So,
yeah.
And it's exacerbated by, like, the problems of true crime are tied up with the problems of journalism.
Right.
And the problems of making crime into entertainment. So as much as it would be easy to kind of disentangle all of those threads, really you have to almost entangle them further and consider them as one big giant system. So I think what it comes down to is, what stories are any of us best equipped to tell? What stories are missing? I mean, the fact is, Unspeakable Acts has one story by one non-white writer. So what perspectives are being missed wholesale because they're not being covered adequately and by people who are necessarily part of the communities that they cover or understand them in a way that others may not. And I just feel like we all benefit when we have a multiplicity of perspective. So that's what I hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to see what comes next, because I think you're right. I think we are at a moment where I think we're about to see a lot of new and different kinds of stories, and a real kind of shift and change in the genre, in all kinds of ways. So I look forward to having this conversation again in a year. I mean, like, oh my gosh, did you see that piece? But should we go?
I mean, I'm already seeing some of that just in the last couple of months. So my hope is that that carries forward over time. My worry is that with any possibility for change and perspective, that they get commodified and turned into cliched entertainment yet again. So I think it just, we gotta keep doing the work and just try real hard not to fall into the same sort of traps of cliche and bias.
Right? I mean, it's a very like there's a real formula.
Yeah.
To, you know, how we tell these stories that goes back to like the detective novels of the third, you know, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, because if you asked me this, I would freeze. But are there any pieces you've read in the last couple months that you want to shout out to here, or is that like
So for a survey of what we've been talking about, Elon Green, one of the contributors in Unspeakable Acts, did this amazing piece for The Appeal with the title "The Pernicious Whiteness of True Crime," where he interviewed Black journalists, Black editors, Black creators about what was happening in true crime and how, what was missing. And I think it's a really important touchstone for where we need to go from here. I also think just from a storytelling standpoint, like Wes Lowery's piece on a lynching that happened in the 80s that GQ published, and I know that there was a documentary component as well. I thought that was super well done. So I'm like, more of that.
More of that. Okay.
Yeah. So let's look at the Q&A. And this one is for Jessica, so I'll read it.
All right.
Would a Jose Martinez type figure still exist in the Central Valley again? And do you think there were any Spanish language publications that address these murders or any local newsletters that address this? It would be interesting to know what the Mexican, Latinx, Indigenous American community talk about amongst themselves.
Okay, so it's a two-part. I think the answer to the first part, could a Jose Martinez figure still exist in the Central Valley again? I mean, I think unfortunately the answer to that question is yes, right? I mean, and I think if you talk to, I talked to a homicide detective from the Valley not too long ago, who in fact, they will all often say like, we don't know what we don't know. And that like, they are, so many people are being, dropped in kind of remote fields that sometimes by the time they find the bodies, it's too late to even start to, it's so yes, sadly, I think it could. To the question of Spanish media, I think there is some Spanish media now. I think back in this, a lot of the real heavy media looking that I did in the newspapers was from the 70s and 80s. And I think I'm not aware that there was like a Spanish language newspaper that I could, I certainly didn't find anything on like Nexus or newspapers.com. I think now there are like, a lot of those papers have faded away. There are Facebook groups, there are like, all kinds of ways of disseminating information. And a lot of it in Spanish. So I think the sort of death of traditional media is both good and bad, because it's sad because there aren't sort of reporters out covering everything, but there are a lot of people covering a lot of stuff. I mean, I can watch Tulare County Board of Supervisors on like 16 different platforms if I want. So yeah, if that answers the question.
Like it's a gift to be able to get unmediated stuff, but the flip side is that if there aren't the people asking the questions that need to be asked, a lot of stuff gets missed. And I think that seems to be just yet another theme of your book, that again, people weren't necessarily making the right connections or asking the questions, and so much that should have been connected together wasn't.
There was just very little, there was not, I wasn't there, but I could pick up very little traces of political pressure to solve these crimes. Right. Whereas like, if you look at, certain other kinds of crimes, it's on the front page of the paper every day, and the Board of Supervisors is being asked about it. And the sheriff is being like called into meetings and demanding to know what's happening. I don't think there was any of that. Yeah. And now I see another question I think is perhaps for me. I'm just guessing based on the question. It says, do you know why he picked his victims? And the answer to that in general is that he was a contract killer. So he was paid to kill them. So he did not pick them. There were a few people that he killed for personal reasons, but mostly he was murdering people because he was getting paid to do it.
I wondered about when you met him, did he talk about the sort of quote professional hit jobs in a different way than he talked about the more personal murders?
Well, that, to be honest, is a question that I did not ask, which is shocking that I didn't ask it. But I think I just really wasn't, to me, it wasn't the why he did it was much less interesting to me than the how he got away with it. I think in general, people that he killed for personal reasons tended to be people that he felt threatened either him or more often someone in his family.
Yeah.
Right. So he killed people he thought threatened his sister. He killed people that he thought threatened his daughter. He killed people that he thought threatened his kid. His threat perception was quite extreme, but that tended to be the motivation. And so now we have an anonymous attendee, which I think can go to both of us. So you should take it, Sarah, which is, are you concerned about the future of being able to authentically be able to report on issues with journalists currently being attacked by law enforcement at protests?
Yeah,
do you think the responsibility to report on police brutality will outweigh the potential for personal injury?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, I feel such awe for people who are out in the streets reporting on these protests or related things. I was just following I guess it's Josie Wong of KPCC, and the fact that she was arrested and they straight up lied that she hadn't identified herself as a journalist when she recorded all this video that showed clearly that they were lying, which again speaks to police's unreliable narrator and the fact that
that goes beyond unreliable narrator.
Yeah, it's the dangers of unreliable narration, and the fact that they're just willing to completely fabricate a narrative and look at journalists as the enemy. And I think, obviously, as a journalist, it's something I am deeply, deeply concerned about, and I think that the next few months are going to be really critical. But I also know that journalists are still going to be out there trying to report and to do the best they can, even under increasingly fraught, dangerous circumstances where press freedom seems to be on a real decline here. What's your sense of it, Jessica?
I think the question of like authentically being able to report on issues with journalists being attacked by law enforcement at protests. I think we're seeing a lot more of journalists being attacked. I think they've always been attacked, right? I remember when I was a little tiny kid reporter, so tiny little apple cheeks in my apple, whatever, and getting trampled by the LAPD horses and sprayed, with pepper spray. And, so it's always happened. I think the thing that's is happening more now, number one, but number two, I think that they're, in the past, I think the big news organizations tended to be like, don't make yourself the story. And so we didn't hear about it as much. And then I think there's also a much more us versus them between police and journalism. And I think, that's leading to just a lot more kind of violence against journalists. I also, in a weird way, not in the coverage of protests, but in the coverage of police more often, I think a slightly more antagonistic relationship between journalism and police officers might lead to better journalism. Because I think, there was often a thing where people didn't ever want, for some people, didn't want to write bad things about the cops because they didn't want the cops to get mad at them and stop telling.
They would lose access.
And I think there was a little bit of, there might, I think the less access journalism we have, the better.
I don't want to say I'm flat out anti-access, but I think that access journalism has done a lot more harm than good. And I think you can do a lot better journalism, maybe not as a straight up antagonist, but just as a counter, as an adversary, of being like, I'm not going to get the story from official sources. How do I get the actual story from, not so much as a workaround, but just from deep reporting and finding the people who you should be talking to who will tell you stuff, and the documents that you need and the research that you need to do. And from them, a much more complete picture will emerge anyway.
Totally true. That said, I think the other thing is people need to comply with various public records acts too, right? And so if the police need to turn over records, even whether they like you or not. So
yeah, if it's the law, it's the law. Give us the records.
Tell it to the judge. But so I do think that we're also seeing less and less information coming out in a lot of places, which I think is a real problem. So it all of these things are double-edged. Okay. Did Martinez enjoy killing? I recently interviewed someone who was a contract killer, then became a priest, then went back to killing because he missed it. Holy moly, wait, that's better than anything we got going. That question is an incredible.
I want to know that story.
That person here. So I think that, did he enjoy killing? I mean, again, I don't think he minded it. I think it wasn't, that really was not, I sort of have this innate, don't like to talk about violence, and it wasn't a question that I really wanted to delve deeply into because I find the answer so horrifying, which probably isn't a very good answer as a journalist. But, I think anyone who kills again and again and again, doesn't mind it. So
but it's also that if your central question was, how did he get away with it? Then the questions that you're going to ask are going to answer that basic question, as opposed to, well, why did you do it? Or did he take pride in it?
I think he did take pride in it. I mean, I think clearly he took pride in it. And I think clearly he took pride in it because he was good at, quote unquote, good at it. And I think, yeah, I think it's it's not the subject of the book, but it's a fascinating thing, people who don't mind killing. I mean, it's why we are fascinated by this, because it's sort of looking into the void. Okay. Did he regret his involvement in the drug trade in his early years? I don't know that I picked up regret about, I think, Sarah's going to answer. Okay.
Oh, no.
Somehow.
No, because that was your question. So you had started. So I think after this, though, there's one more question. So, okay. Take it away.
Yeah. I think, no, I don't think there was, regret in the sense of like, oh, did he feel bad about it? No. I think that as with anyone who looks back upon their life, like there are different paths that life could have taken. And I think, Jose Martinez, for one, had considered being a Marine. And, someone asked me a question not that long ago, like, what do I think would have happened if he would become a Marine? And I was like, I don't know, because you never know, what will happen if a life goes in a different direction. But, so I don't, how about, I don't know. That's my answer to that question.
So I think the last question.
Do we?
Can you tell us the true crime podcasts that you think are good? Okay. So I'm sorry to say I have to look through my queue of what true crime podcasts I'm listening to. So in my library, I would say the sine qua non of amazing true crime podcasts is In the Dark by American Public Media. It's hosted by Madeline Barron. The second season on the case of Curtis Flowers, who was tried 6 times for a crime he didn't commit, and it was reversed by the Supreme Court, and he just was finally released in full. They're not going to try him again. The charges were dropped with prejudice. And I think that podcast is a masterclass in investigative reporting. And generally, when I listen to podcasts, I much prefer the ones that are deeply reported. I did mention earlier a more conversational one called You're Wrong About, which is co-hosted by Sarah Marshall and Michael Hobbs. Hobbs is an enterprise reporter at the Huffington Post. And their whole idea is, let's take a subject that you think you know and do some research and reporting and show that your assumptions are completely upended. So the crime episodes in particular of that podcast are great, but pretty much any episode. Right now they're doing a 2-parter on the Tuskegee experiments, and I'm learning a ton.
And I'm gonna mix it up and say the last podcast I really listened to, which isn't quite true crime, was Nice White Parents. Almost true crime.
That was so good.
So shout out to that, which was really fascinating and arguably also sort of true crime.
I think, I can see how it fits in, and it's about it's about the same underlying prejudice that leads to
Not injustice.
lots of
Yeah.
bad decisions and bad policy. And yeah, Hannah Jaffe-Walt just knocked it out of the park with that one. That was great.
And then the last question is, can either of you share details about upcoming books or articles that you're working on?
You want to go first, Jessica?
I mean, I just sit here editing stories. So mostly what I'm doing right now is editing. I think your answers will be much more interesting.
So I'm waiting on edits for my next book, which hopefully is slated for a fall 2021 release. We'll see. Life in a pandemic and publishing in a pandemic is up for grabs. And the working title is The Convict and the Conservative, and it's about the time when William F. Buckley, who was a founder of the National Review and an architect of the neoconservative movement, helped get a man off death row in New Jersey, and it turned out to be a very, very bad idea. So once more, I'm delving in the mid-century. It begins with the murder of a teenage girl in Bergen County, New Jersey in 1957, and then much transpires over the next 20 years. It gets into attitudes about the death penalty, 60s book publishing, and neoconservative politics.
Wow. Do you have a title?
Right now it's The Convict and the Conservative,
That's the working
which is, I like it as a title, but we'll see if it holds, because it's not just about William F. Buckley and the convict Edgar Smith, it's also about all the women who are in the orbit, from the murder victim, Vicky Zielinski, to the book editor, to various wives and girlfriends and mothers and people connected, and their voices are just as important than the two guys at the center. So more soon.
More soon. Okay. Well, I think we've taken it to the hour.
Pretty much.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any last questions they want to drop in the chat, or should we say our thank yous and our best wishes to Portland for better air?
Well, I think if someone has a question in the next 5 seconds.
It looks like we're good on questions. So
Yeah.
Jessica, it was a real pleasure to talk about true crime in your book for the last hour. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.
Sarah, I guess we just have to have you back in the fall when your next book comes out.
That's the hope and the plan. I always love
Hopefully
to.
in person at that point.
Let's keep our fingers crossed.
And toes, everything. Well, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. It was such a pleasure to host the two of you. Please consider purchasing a copy of each of their books by visiting us at powells.com. And while you're there, be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. And we look forward to seeing you at another one of our events again soon. Take care until then.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.